AWS Identity and Access Management. Welcome back. In this particular video, we will be looking at understanding IAM users, groups, roles, and policies. Then we're going to jump into creating and managing users and roles. We'll look at some of the best practices for securing AWS resources. We'll do a hands-on of creating an IAM users and assigning specific roles and policies. And we will start our first project, which is building an IAM policy to restrict access to S3 for specific users. Let's get started. First topic, understanding IAM users, groups, roles, and policies. Now, AWS Identity and Access Management, also called as IAM, is the service that allows you to manage permissions and control access to AWS resources securely. By configuring IAM, you can define which users or services can interact with specific AWS resources. Some of the key concepts here are IAM users. A user in IAM represents an individual person or application that interacts with AWS resources. Users can have credentials such as a username, password, or access keys to access these AWS services. Users can be assigned permissions via policies. Next, we have IAM groups. Groups are collections of IAM users. Policies applied to groups are inherited by all the users in that particular group. For example, you might have a developers group that grants access to EC2s and S3 services. Grouping users simplifies management by reducing the need to assign policies individually to users. Then we have the IAM roles. Roles are used to grant permissions to AWS services and resources without needing long-term credentials like access keys. IAM roles can be assumed by AWS services, example EC2 or Lambda, enabling them to interact with other AWS services like S3 or DynamoDB. Roles are useful for cross-account access and for managing permissions for applications running on EC2. And IAM policies. Policies are JSON objects that define what actions are allowed or denied for specific AWS resources. Each policy contains statements that describe permissions in terms of first effect, either allow or deny. Then there's action, the specific AWS action, example S3 list bucket, which will list buckets for the user, or EC2 run instances, which will let the user or policy or group or role to run instances. Then resource, the specific resource to which the policy applies. Example, a specific S3 bucket or EC2 instance. I'll show you an example in a minute. Now, policies can be attached to users, groups, or roles. Here is an example on how a policy, basic IAM policy looks like, which allows read access to an S3 bucket. If you see, I've given the version number statement where I have effect, action, and resource. Effect is allow permission. Action is you can get objects from that S3 and you can list buckets from S3, and the resource is the example bucket that I've created. Creating and managing users and roles. Now, how to create IAM users. We're going to jump into doing this, but before that, let's look at just a brief overview. So, if you have to create a new user, in AWS Management Console, we'll go there, we'll go to IAM and then click on users and then add user and define some username. We can choose the type of access, which is programmatic access. This option generates an access key for using AWS CLI or SDK. And we have AWS Management Console access, which allows the user to log into the console. Then we also have like assigning permissions. On the next screen, once you create this user, you can attach policies directly to user or add the user to a group. Best practice would be use IAM groups to assign permissions instead of attaching policies directly to user. And then finally, you review and create. After reviewing the configuration, you click the create user button that will be available. Provide the user with the login credentials, either access keys for CLI API access or login URL for console access. Also, we'll be creating IAM roles where you create a new role where you can go to IAM and roles and create a new role. You choose the AWS service that will assume the role For example, if EC2 needs access to S3, select EC2 as the trusted entity. Then we are going to attach the policies, where you'll attach policies to define the permissions this role will have. For example, grant the role access to an S3 bucket. And then we will assign role to the AWS services. After creating the role, assign it to your EC2 instance or Lambda function. Now let's jump into the hands-on for creating IAM users and assigning roles. Let's start creating IAM users. To create a new user, first let's go to the IAM section. So I'm at the IAM dashboard. It asks me some security recommendations, which we can ignore right now. But here I can start creating IAM users by selecting users and then create a user. I will create a user with username Vivian Arana, and here it is asking me to provide user access to AWS managed console, which is optional, but I want this to be a programmatic access user. The programmatic access option generates an access key for using AWS CLI or SDK. So I'm going to keep it this way, username, and then it will give me options to add user to a group. If there is a group, I can add that user to a particular group, but it says create group, which means we don't have any groups right now. Copy permissions. If you want to copy permissions from existing permissions, you can do that. You can attach policy directly. So there's a lot of different, like if I want to give the user S3 read only per access, I can just select here and give it right now, but I'm not going to give any permissions, anything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and say next in this particular case, and I have my user details here. Console password type none, request password reset none. I'll give the CLI permissions in a minute, and I'm going to say create user. Now the user is created, is not added to any group, doesn't have anything, any access. I'm going to select the user, and here I can add a group to the user. Now there's no groups, so let's create a group first. Add user to a group. Create group, and in this particular case I'll call this group S3 access, and I'll give S3 read only access to this particular user. Create that user group, and that's done here. And I am going to select that group, and I'll say add user to this particular group. So now the user is added to that particular group. Now let's see how we can give the user access to login. So if you see console sign in, so this is where the user can sign in. I'm going to say enable the console sign in, and it will ask me auto generated password or custom password. I'll say auto generated password, enable, and it will create this console username password. I can download this CSV file and share it with the user that I have. Close this. Another thing, I can also create access key for this user, so they can programmatically access the CLI. So I'm going to say create access key, command line interface. I understand. I mean, there's a bunch of different options you can give them, but I'm just going to do that. Next, description tag, I'm going to say my IAM test user, create access key, and it does this, and I can pass this options to the user too. Done. Now let me make sure that I download it and share it with the user. Done. And that takes care of giving user credentials and access to the console sign in. So that's all we need to do here. Perfect. Now let's go back to the users. Click on him again one more time. Let's look at permissions, part of a group, so that permissions are added there. Tags, we've created a tag over here, my IAM test user. We've given security credentials. So this all works fine. Now next part, which is creating IAM roles. So I'm going to go inside roles, and here you can create IAM roles by clicking on create role. I'm going to select AWS service that will assume that particular role. For example, if EC2 needs access to S3, select EC2 as the trusted entity. So here I can service or use, I'm going to say EC2 is what I need. Next, and here the policies are available, and I can say that I want to attach a policy to grant role access to S3 bucket. So I'm going to say S3, say allow S3 full access. This is how I can provide access and assign role to the AWS services. After I am done with this, next role name, I'm going to say S3 access for EC2, allow EC2 instances on your behalf, and Amazon S3 full access, and I'll say create a role. So this is how you can create a role, and it's available here. You can go click on this and look at what permissions it has. You can look at trust relationships. We have tags, access advisor, and revoke sessions. So if there's an active sessions, you can revoke those sessions from here. So how do you use this role to assign to an EC2? So first what I'm going to do is, let's go to EC2, and my EC2 doesn't have any instances running. There's an instance running, but I think it's an instance that we terminated. So I am going to go to instances and say launch instances. I'm going to give it test IAM instance. I'm just going to create it just to test it out. Use the basic stuff. Select key pair. I don't have a key pair, so I'm going to say create a new key pair, test key pair, because I'm not going to use this. Create key pair, leave everything default, and I'll say launch instance. It's going to launch this instance, and now I want to assign that role to this particular instance. So I'm going to go to the instances. Let's see, refresh, and the one that is probably this one, which is not yet started up. I'm going to refresh it, and now it's running. So I'm going to select this instance, and inside this I'm going to look for where I can assign a particular role. So you can select in actions here. You can just go click on security and say modify IAM role, and here I can look for that S3 access for EC2 IAM role, update the IAM role, and that is assigned to this particular test IAM instance role. So this is how you can assign roles to your EC2 instances. Now EC2 can access that S3 bucket on your behalf in this particular case. If you have any questions or had any issues doing this, let me know in the comments and I'll get back to you. Best practices for securing AWS resources. Now, securing your AWS environment with IAM is crucial for minimizing the risk of unauthorized access. Here are some of the best practices. First, enable MFA for privileged users. This multi-factor authentication, MFA, provides an extra layer of security. Enable MFA on the root account and for users with high-level permissions, example admin roles. In our example, we have, in our previous videos, we have not done this because we are not using this for real purposes. We are just using the AWS account just to learn these things, but it's the best practice to enable MFA for privileged users. Follow the principle of least privilege. Always assign the minimum permissions necessary for users or services to perform their task, and regularly review and audit permissions to ensure users or roles are not overprivileged. Avoid using the root account, and that's one of the best practice, and we've been using root account constantly. The reason is, again, we are doing this for tutorial purposes. The root account has full control of your AWS environment and should only be used for critical tasks. Creating individual IAM users for daily operations and secure the root account with MFA. Rotate the credentials regularly. Rotate access keys and passwords periodically to reduce the risk of compromised credentials. Use AWS Secrets Manager or AWS Systems Manager parameter store to manage secrets and rotate them securely. Use IAM roles for applications. Instead of embedding access keys in your application, assign IAM roles to AWS resources like EC2 instances or Lambda functions. This avoids the risk of exposing long-term credentials. Audit AWS IAM with CloudTrail. Enable AWS CloudTrail to track all IAM related activities such as user logins, role assumptions, and policy changes, and regularly review the logs for suspicious activities. I know a lot of things that we covered here, we have not yet looked at them, but we will be learning them as and when the video progresses. Hands-on. This is our hands-on exercise where we'll be creating IAM users and assigning specific roles and policies. So in this particular exercise, we'll create IAM users, assign roles and policies, and explore different permission configurations. What we will be covering here is creating a new IAM user, assigning specific policies, and test permissions. So let's jump in and start with our hands-on exercise. So first step is to create a new IAM user. So I'm going to go to my AWS management console, go to IAM. I have cleared out all the users, so it's like starting from blank. Create a user, let's say create user, and next. I am going to, in this particular case, let's say create a group, and in this particular group I am going to give him access to S3 read-only access. So I am going to call this S3 read-only access, S3 read-only, create user group. So I have that S3 read-only access. Next, and in here I don't want to do anything. Review, create, and my user has been created here. Now I have to give this particular user access to CLI, SDK, API, all those things. Go to security credentials. I'm going to say enable console, enable. It's going to download, close, and I'm going to give create access key. So I'm going to say create access key, command line. I understand. Next, this create access key. So I've created the access key. I'm going to open terminal and quickly configure for this user. Configure. I need access key. I need to change the access key to this. Secret key, copy, and default region, that's fine. Default output format JSON is fine. So I've created that. Now next, I am going to make sure that there is a S3 bucket available for us. So I'm going to jump to, okay, let me make say done here. Now let's download this just in case, done. And I'm going to go to S3 buckets now, create a bucket. Create a bucket called say IAM test bucket. It doesn't give any problem. ACLs, all these things, create a bucket. And I think I forgot something. Oh, this thing is already exists. I bucket test. Okay, that's fine as long as I can create one. So IAM test bucket test has been created. I can go inside this. I can upload some files here. Say upload. I can open my finder. I have a test.py file which I can just drag and drop here, and that's the file that I want to upload. I'm going to say upload, and it will upload the file. So my IAM bucket has a file. Close. I'm going to try to go back to this here, and I can say AWS S3 ls. It will say that when calling the list buckets operation is not authorized for S3 list all buckets because no identity based policy allows. So that means we have to do that other thing, which is assign specific policies. So what I'm going to do is next is I'm going to assign the specific policies. So I'm going to go back to my browser here, and I am going to go back to IAM. In here, go to policies, create a policy, and this policy that I am going to use, we've done this before using Visual. Let's do it one with JSON. So in here, version statement allow, and what do I want to allow here? I want to allow an action which is S3 list bucket, and I want to do S3 get object, so I can get objects from that particular bucket. So those are my actions. Resource, now I need to get that resource. So what I'm going to do is, without even closing this, I'm going to say open in new tab, open S3. I want to get the ARN for that. I can go to properties for the bucket, and here is my ARN. I'll copy that, go back, and in the resource I'll paste that ARN, so I have access to that particular bucket. That's what it says. Let's say next, policy name S3 test policy. Don't have to add anything here. I hope that is not take. And say create the policy. So now that policy is created. Once the policy is created, I can go to that particular user and say I want to add a permission. I can create inline policies too here, but it's always better to create a policy so we can give access to users. So say attach policy directly, and the policy that we created was something with test. So here is the S3 test policy. Say next and add the permission. And now that user has the permission to list and get objects for a particular bucket that we created. So now we're going to go back to the terminal and see if that worked. It says access denied. It takes some time sometimes, so I'm going to clear it out. Try again. Oh, the problem here is I am trying to list all my buckets. So let's try to list only the bucket that we're interested in, which is S3:/ and my buckets. This is the name of the bucket. And there you go. I can list the contents of this bucket right here. If I remove that again, just to test it out, if I remove this policy from the user, let's see, permission policies, remove policy, clear it out. Let's run this again. And you see error occurred. So because I removed the policy, the user cannot access it anymore. So that's how this works. So that kind of got us through the first we created a new IAM user, we assigned specific policies, and then we tested the permissions by adding and removing the policy. So if you have any questions or if you had any issues, let me know in the comments and I'll get back to you. First project, build an IAM policy to restrict access to S3 for specific users. In this particular project, the objective is you will create a policy that restricts access to specific S3 buckets for particular IAM users. This is a common use case where certain users should only have access to specific buckets within an AWS account. First, create a custom IAM policy, then assign the policy, test the policy, and finally audit the activity. So let's get started with building this project. So create a custom IAM policy. I'm going to use whatever we did in the previous section for hands-on and continue from there. So it says create a custom IAM policy. So first, I'm going to create a custom IAM policy where what we mentioned was we will make sure that a particular user or this policy has full access to one S3 bucket and denies access to all the other buckets. So what we're going to do here is I am going to create first, let's create some S3 buckets. We have one already, which is IAM test from our hands-on that we did. I'm going to create another. This one should be forbidden. And I'm going to create this bucket. I'm going to say don't touch this. Create another bucket. Don't touch this. Create that bucket. Buck. Don't touch this buck since it's already name is already taken. So I have three buckets here. This one should be forbidden. IAM test bucket test. Don't touch this bucket. Now currently our user, if you remember from our last step, I am saying ls s3, he can't access this. Let's see what else can he. If I say list all the buckets, he can't see anything. There's no list all my buckets access to this user. So let's create the policy first. So I'm going to go to IAM, and here I'm going to create the custom IAM policy. Let's say policies, create a policy, and I'm going to go with JSON again, just so that it's much more easier to look at. I am also trying to open that S3 in a new tab, so I know the names or addresses of those, or resource addresses. And here I am going to first say allow. The first statement is allow, and inside this the action should be, I'm going to go ahead and say S3 list bucket. That's for listing the buckets. And if I want to get object from there, I'll say S3 get object. That's the next one. And if I want to put stuff in there, so I want full access, so I'm gonna say put object. So I have all three options here, which is S3 list bucket, S3 get object, and S3 put object for which resource. Let me add that resource name. I am the test bucket test, and properties, I can copy this here, and here I will say this is the location of the bucket. And if you want to give this to all the items inside there, you can say /star, so whatever is inside that bucket you'll have full access to that too. So that takes care of that. Now next thing is to deny access to everything else. So here I am going to create another statement. I'm going to copy this thing here just so that, and this one I'll name it as statement 2, and here I'll say deny, and my action will be, in this case, instead of an array, I am just going to say I want to use S3 star everything. So they actually go in order. So if the first one says allow to this bucket, and this bucket with these access, this will take place first, and then it will look at this. So if it's only specific to one bucket, when it's accessing the second bucket, it will look at the second statement and see that I am saying deny to all the resources. And here inside my resources, I am going to say, instead of this, I'll open the array, and here I'll say ARN AWS S3 star, which means everything. That's closed, and I can also do the same thing for the content inside here. ARN AWS S3 : star/star. So all the contents too, not just inside. Now in here I will also add a condition, and for that I can say condition. The condition that I want is string not equals and S3 prefix is not equal to our bucket that we have. So that's IAM test bucket. So except for this bucket, everything else is denied. So that's how you can create a policy here to do what we wanted to do. And say next, policy name, I'll say test project 2. It has my limited list read, create the policy, and my policy is created. Let's look at it if it exists. Test, there you go, test, which one was test project 2. This was our project's policy that we created. So what we did right now was created a custom IAM policy. Next type is assigning this particular policy to a particular user. So we have a user here. I'm going to say user permission here. So I'm going to say add permissions, attach policy, and the policy is test project 2 next, add permissions. So I've added that permission, and now once I've added that permission, I think we should be good to go. Let's go back here. Next is test the policy. So let's test it out. I am going to go here and say it's going to give me access to that particular bucket. Whereas if I try to give the other bucket name, which was do not touch this bucket, it will say error occurred. At the same time, this one is forbidden or whatever that name was, it will give me an error. So what we did over here was we went to created a custom IAM policy, assigned the policy to a user, we tested the policy, and for audit the activity where we'll be using CloudTrail, we'll probably leave it for later when we are actually have done something on CloudTrail. So I'm going to stop it here and we can jump into the next section. If you have any questions or any problems that you faced, let me know in the comments and I'll get back to you.